from receiving grants because of immigration provisions in the consent decree. Ms. Gupta, given that there are legitimate concerns in the New Orleans policy by folks here, did you seek a judicial review of the policy by a district court to determine whether or not it complied with Section 1373?
The district court at both points, both in February and in issuing this revised policy, had reviewed the policies. Yes.
Well, my time's expired, but since the Attorney General doesn't respond to any of my letters, Ms. Gupta, I wonder if you might carry a message to her, and that message would be on behalf of my constituents and millions of Americans, that if she really believes in enforcing the rule of law, then I think she ought to be prosecuting jurisdictions that violate federal immigration policy instead of writing them checks. And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Mr. Chairman. From Texas yields back. The chair will now recognize himself. Mr. Butterworth, what's the penalty for crossing a border unlawfully?
I would defer to the Department of Justice on any.
Well, let's try it this way. Who has exclusive jurisdiction over immigration cases?
Again, it's outside of my lane, but I would say it's CBP or ICE.
So it'd be federal. It's exclusively federal.
Yes, sir.
Both, and they're really, unless you can think of something I can't think of, it's either crossing a border unlawfully or overstaying a visa would be about the only ways you could get in the country unlawfully. Only two ways I can think of. You either cross one of our territorial boundaries or you're invited in and you overstay your visa. And those are both exclusively federal. But I think you'll agree with me that almost all of our interactions in life are with state and local law enforcement. It's not an FBI agent who stops us for speeding. It's not an ATF agent who is working the bar scene. So if most of our citizen police encounters are state and local, and yet immigration is exclusively federal, how are the federal officers supposed to know about folks who are not here lawfully?
Sir, the Department of Homeland Security has the PEP program, which I am not at liberty to speak on. But I would say if Congress passed a law that commandeered every local police officer and wanted to pay for that, then I think we would welcome it.
When you say, well, commandeer is such a pejorative word, how about we just say cooperate? I mean, you don't commandeer people for your terrorism task forces, do you? You don't commandeer people for your narcotics task forces, do you? It's called cooperation. And yet you have a policy that says that New Orleans Police Department members shall not make inquiries into an individual's immigration status. What do you mean by inquiries?
Sir, if there's a criminal in New Orleans and an officer interacts with that person and there's a criminal warrant, that person.
See, I don't know what you mean by criminal. You mean if the person has, if there's probable cause to believe that an offense was committed, or if there's already an outstanding warrant?
If there's a state, federal, or local warrant or probable cause that an officer observes conduct that's criminal, they will arrest the person.
All right, and then they can inquire as to the person's status.
Our officers under this policy do not inquire about a person's immigration status.
They can or cannot?
Under this policy, they do not inquire about a person's immigration status.
Why not?
Because we believe that, one, this follows federal law, and two...
How are the federal law enforcement officers supposed to know who is here unlawfully if your officers don't inquire? They're not the ones that are interacting with them. They're not enforcing traffic laws. They don't respond to domestic violence calls. The FBI doesn't have jurisdiction over that. That would be your state and local officers. So how is that supposed to happen?
Sir, I think your concerns are with the broader system and not with this policy. In New Orleans, we arrest every criminal that we interact with. We bring them to the jail.
I love the way you phrase that. You arrest every criminal you interact with. They're only a criminal after they've had a jury trial, Mr. Butterworth. They're a suspect up until that point.
Correct.
Mr. Horowitz, if their original policy was okay, why did they revise it?
I don't know the answer to that question, Mr. Chairman. You'd have to ask the Civil Rights Division.
Well, you're a good lawyer, Mr. Horowitz. If the original contract was fine, you usually don't draft another one unless you just love paying lawyers. I mean, if your original indictment was okay, did you have a superseding indictment?
Generally not.
No, you don't. So if the original policy is fine, why did we get this brand new policy?
Well, obviously, our memorandum outlining the concerns we had about the provision that then existed may well have triggered the revisions.
I hate to be cynical, but I think you're right. Ms. Gupta, you said you were a prosecutor. There was a question I got way back in time that I never really had a good answer for. Whenever a family member who had lost a loved one to an act of violence, to someone who was out on bond, would ask me, why was that person out of jail? I never really had a good answer. I mean, you can cite the Constitution that you're really entitled to bond absent some circumstances, but that's kind of a hollow explanation. So what would the explanation be to those who have lost loved ones to violent crime for people who are here unlawfully and the federal government knows it?
There is, for somebody who's been accused of a violent crime, the NOPD is absolutely entitled and in its authority to prosecute to the law to the fullest. And there's nothing in this policy.
You're either missing my point inadvertently or you're missing my point intentionally. I realize you prosecute people after the homicide. I'm trying to figure out how to prevent the homicide. What is the explanation for why the person wasn't dealt with before the murder?
Well, let me just again make clear that the reason we undertook the policy was to ensure that NOPD could fight violent crime, could get the kind of critical information from victims and witnesses who need to share critical crime information with the NOPD in order to solve and prevent violent crime in that jurisdiction.
Ms. Gupta, you and I both know that we rely on all sorts of witnesses, some of whom, frankly, expose themselves to criminal liability in the process of cooperating. So the notion that you have to give amnesty to people before they will cooperate with law enforcement has not been my experience. But Attorney General Landry, I'm out of time. You asked the question, how do you answer it when family members ask you, why was this person not dealt with before they committed the act of violence? I never really had a good answer to that one.
Unfortunately, I've had to answer that question in Louisiana here lately. And the best way I answer them is that our system in this country is broken.
With that, I would thank all the witnesses.
Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent for 1 minute, please?
Well, if the gentleman from Texas does it, then I'm sure the gentleman from Texas and the gentleman from Colorado are going to want to do it too.
Let me be very brief, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you can have a minute.
Thank you so very much. First of all, I want to make it very clear that I don't think there's one member here does not feel the deep pain for the families who lost loved ones, particularly those who died in the terrible crash trying to help others during the Baton Rouge disaster and flooding. I'm from Texas, and I feel for my brothers and sisters in Louisiana, and I was there for them in Katrina, so my deepest sympathy. I do want to make sure, however, General Landry, you're not asking for New Orleans to be prevented from getting federal funds. Is that correct? You're not asking us to block New Orleans from getting federal funds.
I'm asking New Orleans to follow federal law, like I would ask all of the cities in New Orleans.
I understand, but you're not asking for there to be a declaration for New Orleans not to receive federal funds from the Department of Justice.
No, I've been asking for the state to withhold funds from New Orleans for violating federal law.
Okay, but let me ask Ms. Gupta, is New Orleans violating federal law?
No, New Orleans, under this policy, the policy does not violate federal law, and right now we're working with the city of New Orleans to ensure constitutional policing.
That they are communicating with ICE and you're not blocking that, because that's what I want to make sure is happening.
That's right. The policy makes clear that NOPD can communicate with ICE and request information from ICE about a person's immigration status and citizenship.
And deal with criminals on the
Gentlelady's
street.
time has expired.
Thank you so very much for your service, all of you. Thank you.
That I would thank all four of our witnesses. Members are advised they will have 5 legislative days to submit additional materials to the record. With that, thank you again to the 4 witnesses, and we are adjourned.